Hi everyone. Anthony Hood Tano here. Zika's dad. The internet's busiest music nerd. And it's time for a review of the new Z's album. Z. This, I believe, is the 5th full-length LP. If I'm wrong on that, don't break my balls. I know they had a remix album of New Slaves. I'm not really counting that. Again, I'm counting 5 albums. 5th album, I think so. These guys are an experimental rock group and avant-garde music band, one of the more prominent groups from New York right now in this style. They started to turn heads in the aughts with albums like Arms, and they finished that decade out with one of their most large and ambitious albums yet, New Slaves. And while Z's music may be strange and it may be abrasive at times, I also think it's kind of engaging. It's dense, it's technical, there's a lot going on, it's lively, and to an extent I think it's kind of playful, or at least I interpret it to be playful or fun or weird. I find a lot of the challenges presented in their music to be kind of awe-inspiring and creative, imaginative. And there are some really bold and clear influences coming from jazz music, as well as the very noisy and abrasive no-wave scene in New York from decades back. There are occasionally some weird grooves, odd times from the school of math rock. Chaotic free improvisation, noise music, as well as drone. With all of these stylistic influences, a Z's record could go in any direction, and it does oftentimes. But there are some constants running throughout a lot of these albums. With each Z's project, you could expect some sax freakouts and some very skilled drumming and unusual, difficult guitars. And during their sextet years, the band put out some pretty dense, complicated recordings. But on this latest album here, the band is now being stripped back to a trio. We have Sam Hilmer on tenor sax. Longtime fans of the band will remember him. And then we have more recent additions to the group, like guitarist, composer Patrick Higgins, as well as drummer supreme Greg Fox of Guardian Alien and Liturgy fame. So new members, very similar MO when compared to previous records as well, but I would say Z's go about what they usually do with a sort of different flavor. I would say comparatively, this new version of Z's is toned down, subtler. The longest moments on this record don't exactly reach the intense highs of some of the songs on New Slaves, but there are a lot of very lively, in-the-moment and intimate performances on this record. The compositions on this LP rely on an incredible amount of repetition, which is another characteristic of Z's music, usually. But in this instance here, without the incredible noise and aggression and layered instrumentation, there isn't much else to focus on other than the repetition. And I would say the result is just more cerebral, more hypnotic than usual for Z's, and the progressions of these tracks are very gradual a lot of the time. Case in point with Greg Fox's drumming. Usually in these longer tracks, he's focusing not on his entire kit, but a few key drums on which he is playing some really dizzying and amazing rhythms. Just these little micro rhythms, just so detailed and just full of minor changes. So while Z is not one of Z's most hard-hitting releases, I still do think this project offers up a lot of virtuosity and kinetic energy. The record actually brings one of its noisiest moments, The Future of Royalty, right at the start. It's just about a 2-minute track, and it kicks off with a lot of very noisy, dissonant lead melodies backed up with these drums that sound like they're keeping the pace of the freakiest, most insane marching band you've ever heard. I just wish the track was a little longer, really. But what's interesting is this track, and pretty much every other song here, segues into one another quite nicely, so there is a really great flow to this album, I think, and the album suddenly devolves from just freaky parade to total freak show science experiment on this track called Wolf Government, which feels like a very noisy, primordial, stiff soundscape. This track is the sound of cells splitting and electrons orbiting. Sporadic, distorted glitches, and then we move on to dizzying, cycling noise. Then a textured drone punctuated by these sparkling melodies. While it is one of the album's more abstract moments, it's still a pretty fun track to listen to because there's a lot going on. It's a very engaging drone. Some twangy lead guitars lead this track into one of my favorite moments on this record, Core, or Corpse. These lead guitars I mentioned actually kind of sound like something you would hear on a Battles album. So if you're into those thin, bouncy, math rocky guitar leads, I think you'll dig this track a lot. However, the song doesn't develop into a explosive, normal, just kind of exciting rock verse, chorus, verse progression. This track instead is very meditative, and with some saxophone hanging in the background, it does some interesting things in the right channel as well as the left channel. It's like we get some weird effects or maybe just some strange overdubbing in one channel that we're not getting in another that just kind of changes things up. And this little lead melody, this little phrase that the song introduces at the beginning exists throughout much of the track, and the band just kind of figures out different ways to slightly alter this groove or intensify it or just kind of just simmer it and bring it down. It's actually very pleasant and hypnotic and really interesting, I think. However, I don't think this formula works all the time. On the very similar closer, the repetitions get kind of tedious, especially with the plucked harmonic notes on the guitar, though I do think the ending of this track is really immense and does leave the album off feeling kind of climactic. It did remind me of something really interesting, or it did make me think of a strange situation. These really repetitive phrases are kind of alternated with these sax freakouts and this kind of descending weird guitar riff, and it kind of sounds like being really frustrated trying to figure your way through a maze of some sort, and then the song gets really loud as you realize that you're right where you started at the beginning again, and the song explodes at the very end with you know, maybe just the most intense frustration of the entire track that maybe you're never getting out of this maze. Overall, my experience with this record was really positive. I think it's a great album. I loved a lot of moments in the midst of this LP. It's intriguing. Again, I don't think it's quite as freakish as some of Z's most recent material, but I think the way they approach oddity on this album is a little more beautiful and concise and pretty direct too, because this album is just about 5 tracks, 40 minutes. There are moments that I would say are somewhat catchy, memorable on this album. The playing is consistently impressive. The flow of these tracks is great. The entire album goes off without any major hitches or just potholes with a single track. And while this record probably will not be one of the most controversial in Z's discography, mostly because it's not really a loud, extreme spectacle, I think people who are a little more detail-oriented and would really just love to get lost in a expansive, abstract music piece, those kinds of listeners will really get the most out of this record. I'm feeling a strong 7 to a light 8 on this thing. Transition. If you've given this album a listen, what did you think of it? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Why? What do you think I should review next? And that's it. Anthony Fantano, Zeus, forever.